slideshow. Slideshow, please. Thank you. Okay, so in this particular objective, we're going to describe the catch-up effect, but we have to first explain the law of diminishing returns. So I'm going to go ahead with the intro, show you another video, and then come back and describe the catch-up effect. Okay, so first of all, I wanted to take a moment just to talk to you about our Cobb-Douglas production function. So remember, we're going to use that Y is equal to GDP. This is actually a mathematical equation. So what it is the state of technology, which we're going to put here. So that's technology, is going to be a function, okay, of, and we're going to say, again, think back to your factors of production: land, labor, and capital. Okay, so land, we're going to call N for natural resources. So we're going to say that GDP is a function of natural resources. That's our land component. Labor, we're going to split into two different ideas. We're going to first say L for labor, and that's the number of people. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and say L. And then we're going to say H. And that's going to be human capital, okay? And what human capital are the skills and abilities. Okay, so we're going to say H. And then we're going to say capital. And instead of using C for capital, we're going to use K, which is named after Karl Marx. That's why that's there. But this, again, is like machinery, those kind of things. Anything that's used to produce a good or a service. Now, there's a couple of things about the production function. As we increase any one of these variables, let me just get a different pen color here. As we increase any of these variables, there is what we call constant returns to scale. So if we increase each of these variables by 2, then what will happen is on the other side of the equation, we'll get twice as much GDP. So it does share the constant returns to scale. Now, the reason I'm presenting this here is that we want to talk about if we're spending tax dollars in these next objectives and we spend them on land, what will happen to GDP? If we spend them on population growth, what will happen to GDP? If we spend it on education, what will happen to GDP? And if we spend it on machinery or innovation, what will happen to GDP? Okay. Now, let's talk about this law of diminishing returns. Basically, the law of diminishing returns says if we increase savings, because here we have a higher savings rate, then what that means is that we're going to be able to spend less, because the two things at this point that you could do with your money is spend it or save it. So we're going to decrease spending. And when we decrease spending, that means that businesses need less land, less labor, and less capital. So essentially, we end up with fewer resources. Then what happens is, because we increase our savings, then we can loan that back out as investment. And that investment, the capital stock, increases, raising productivity. Now, the law of diminishing returns says if we make a substantial change in one of the factors of production, then what will happen is we will increase GDP, but we will do so at a decreasing rate. So let's take a look at this. So the law of diminishing returns kind of stated here, but I think I can make it a little bit easier to understand. So let's imagine that we have a farmer who has 5 acres of land. Okay, so I'm going to hold land here constant at 5 acres. I'm going to hold the number of workers constant as well, so labor. So I'm going to say they have 3 workers. So there's my land, there's my labor, so labor. I'm going to hold the amount of skills and abilities. I'm not putting anything into training, so the human capital I'm going to hold constant as well. I'm also going to hold the current state of technology constant. I'm going to say that the input that we're putting in here has not changed dramatically over the time that we're going to put it in. And then what I'm going to mess with here is capital. And I'm going to say that the farmer has 3 workers holding the technology and tractors constant, and they're going to buy or use 1 tractor. Previously had none. So what's going to happen to output? And as they buy the 1 tractor, their output is going to increase. And I'm just making these numbers up, but let's say to 10,000 bushels. Okay. Now, as they buy a 2nd tractor, I know that their output's going to increase, but it's going to increase at a decreasing rate. What I mean is this is not going to be an additional 10,000. It's going to be something less than 10,000. And the reason is now we have 2 tractors that we have to coordinate with. We have 3 workers and only 2 tractors. So it's going to take us more time to coordinate who's going to do what, who's going to be using the tractors. So I'm going to say that this gives us an additional 8,000, something less than 10. So now our output is at 18,000 bushels. We are going to add a 3rd tractor. And again, I know that it's going to increase, but it's going to be increasing less than 8,000 because it takes even more time to coordinate the effort. So maybe 6,000. So that's what, 24,000 bushels. Then I'm going to add a 4th tractor and so on. As I add each tractor, the amount of output that I get, notice it does still go up, but it goes up less so in an incremental way. So the incremental output is decreasing. And if I wanted to show this in a graph, I could certainly do that because it would really illustrate this idea of the law of diminishing returns. So let me go ahead and do that. So here's a graph. I'm going to go ahead and put output here. I'm going to go ahead and put capital over here per worker. And it's going to look like this. Because would there be a point where I would have way too many tractors, particularly if I'm holding land constant at 5 acres? If I end up somewhere with 100 tractors, everybody's getting in each other's way. It's just not going to be productive. So I could end up on this side with too much input. Now, this law of diminishing returns goes a long way to showing why some countries grow more rapidly than others. Here is just the idea of output per worker. And so here we have the first worker who has 1 tractor, right? So this is going from, let's see, say 2 tractors, okay? This was our level of output at 2 tractors, 2 tractors, 2 tractors. And then we added a tractor. And so our output increased rapidly from 3 tractors, okay? But notice that, and this is what I want you to look at, is here's our change in input. And if I take that same line, kind of push it up here and move it, looks like that was the amount of our input. Again, how much is our input change? And we got a little bit more than that. So that was a good idea to do that. Whereas up here, we're in a different state. And maybe we have 6 tractors. And this was our output with 6 tractors. Now I'm going to add, I should say right here was our output with 6 tractors. Let me erase that first one, not to confuse you. Come on. Okay. So go ahead and erase that one. There we go. Okay. Okay. So now I add a 7th tractor. And notice that my gain that I got from that seventh tractor is substantially smaller than the gain that I got when I went from 2 to 3. Okay, so what should we remember? In the law of diminishing returns, as we increase our input, the gains that we get from that input or the increase in output, it increases output, but it does so at a smaller incremental rate each time. So is there a right amount of tractors to have? And the answer to that is yes, but that's a little more micro in focus. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to go ahead and show you a short video on the production function, actually the law of diminishing returns, and then we're going to come back and then apply it to the catch-up effect. Thanks.
The law of diminishing returns. It's a simple idea, but it affects us all, and like it or not, it shapes our future. How? Well, think about it. The world has never spent more on military weaponry than it does today, yet most of us feel less secure than ever. At the same time, while statistics say our economy is growing, most people are no better off than they were a decade ago, and increasing numbers are actually losing ground. These are complicated problems we usually try to explain with political and economic theories. But they're also examples of diminishing returns. In economics, the law of diminishing returns says that increasing any factor of production beyond its optimum results in declining marginal returns in output. Eventually, returns go negative, so each added increment of input actually makes us worse off. Here's a simple, intuitive way of grasping the concept. If I have a cup of espresso before I sit down at my desk, I'll get more work done. If I have 2 cups, maybe I'll do more work, but the quality will begin to suffer. If I have 3 cups, I'll reach the point of negative returns on espresso. I'll be a wild-eyed, nervous wreck, unable to accomplish anything worthwhile. This same principle is also at work in the systems that run our world. Let's look at money. We have a debt-based money system. So if we want the monetary economy to grow, then we always need more debt. Adding new debt to the economy has a multiplying effect because each new dollar in circulation changes hands many times. So more debt is good, right? Well, unfortunately, the productivity of new debt has been falling for several decades. We're just about at the point where adding more debt doesn't help the economy at all. It just adds burden and risk. How about energy? Energy is more basic than money. It powers transportation, manufacturing, the real physical economy. But it costs energy to get energy. It takes energy to drill an oil well or to build a solar panel. When we discovered fossil fuels, we suddenly got a handle on amazingly productive energy sources. A single unit of energy invested in digging or drilling for coal, oil, or natural gas could yield 50 or 100 units of energy that could be put to work somewhere in the economy. However, we've targeted the easiest and best fossil fuels first. Extracting oil from tar sands or shale takes a lot of energy, so the amount of energy we net is declining fast. The Economist magazine recently commented that the direction of change seems clear. If the world were a giant company, its return on capital would be falling. When we look at the relationship between industrial society and our natural environment, it's absolutely clear that we're on a path of diminishing returns. Over 40 years ago, a team of scientists programmed a computer to model the likely interactions between population growth, resource depletion, and environmental pollution. The resulting business-as-usual scenario showed world industrial output starting to shrink before the middle of the 21st century. Recent studies confirm we're following that scenario closely. But why worry? Humanity always solves its problems and moves forward, right? Well, not always. Archaeologists say there were about 24 civilizations prior to our own, complex societies with cities, full-time division of labor, writing, money. But all of them, all eventually fell apart. After moving forward, they went backward. Why? Civilizations tend to use complexity to solve their problems. Think specialization, technology, bureaucracy. Historically, these societies' investments in complexity reached declining returns and finally negative returns. The environment grew polluted, resources got used up, taxes became unbearable, social tensions flared, and armies could no longer keep barbarians at bay, much less extract further spoils from conquest. Then collapse happened. Bummer. So what does that mean for us? That we should just give up? No. But it does tell us that just doubling down on strategies that worked in the past may not be a ticket to further success in the future. Fossil fuels, debt, and societal complexity propelled us forward in the 20th century. But now, not so much. Maybe we should prepare for a future of less debt and less fossil energy. Rather than looking for somebody to blame when our investments in complexity don't bear fruit, we should change our expectations and our strategies for achieving them. Envision a world of less overall complexity. Think slower, smaller, less population, less specialization, less resource consumption, less pollution, more local, more renewable, more do-it-yourself. If we plan for that kind of future, we can optimize the transition and the outcome. If we don't, we could end up as just one more failed civilization to puzzle future archaeologists.
Okay, now that you know a little bit more about the law of diminishing returns, let's go ahead into our next slide. And we're going to go ahead and talk about this catch-up effect. So the catch-up effect says it really all depends on where countries start from. So remember that country Mali that we had back at the beginning of this chapter? Go ahead and see if I can, there we go. So what we're going to do is illustrate, we're going to go ahead and put the idea of a production possibilities frontier in that law of diminishing returns. And we're going to start here with Mali. And I'm going to call this Mali 1. I'm going to put capital down here. And I'm going to put output per capital. So we're going to follow this up. And I'll call this Mali 1 because we need a current state to start from. Here's our output of Mali 1. And then I'm going to go ahead and put the United States on here. We have a lot more capital, obviously. So the US 1, follow it up, US 1, and follow it over. So the US 1. Okay, now let's say that the International Monetary Fund gives a substantial amount of machinery to each country. And so we're going to illustrate that first. Let me go ahead and get a proportion here. And let's see what the change is. So let me go back to Mali. Okay, so this is the amount of resources, or in this particular example, the amount of machinery that was given to Mali. So now we have Mali 2 after that investment. We're going to go ahead and see if I can draw a straight line and follow that up to our graph. Does Mali gain from it? And the answer is yes, Mali definitely gains from it. So here's Mali 2 after that investment by the International Monetary Fund. So take a look right here to kind of illustrate those gains. See that this is the amount that the input was, okay? And this is the amount of the output, almost a 1-to-1, maybe a 1 to a little more than a 1-to-1 gain. Now, we're going to make the same amount of investment here in the US. Do that different color blue. All right, so looks like to me maybe right here. Okay, US 2 got the same amount of money from the International Monetary Fund, the same amount of capital. Here's the US 2. Ooh, I would say it's going to be very slight. Again, if I could draw a straight line, it'd be scary. So here's US 2. So notice the gain. Let's go back and change up our colors again. Yeah, let's do this one. So here's the gain. Here's the, I'm sorry, not the gain, the investment from the International Monetary Fund, and it's something substantially less. Now, why is it? Well, this explains the catch-up effect. And the reason for the catch-up effect is that, change up my thing, is that it all depends on where you start from. Because the US already had considerable resources or machinery, then the gain or the growth that they get from that investment is relatively low. Whereas Mali had few resources, so the gain that they get is quite large. So it kind of depends on where you start from. And that's the idea of the catch-up effect. So we can see that rich countries, an additional capital investment has a small impact because they already have so much. Whereas poor countries, an additional capital investment makes a large impact. And so that's why it's reflected in their growth rates. So poorer countries will grow faster than rich countries. Will they ever be able to catch up? And the answer is yes, they will be able to catch up because they don't have a lot to begin with. But as they start to catch up, those growth rates will become smaller and smaller. Okay, so now I think I have one more video for you, and then we're done with this objective. Thanks for your time.
There are 196 countries in the world. 25 of them are very rich, defined as having an average wealth per person of over $100,000 a year. They are. But far more countries are quite poor, and some, which we're considering here, are very, very poor. These are the 20 poorest countries in the world, where the per capita wealth is under $1,000 a year, or under $3 a day. Every country is now more or less on a path to growth, but the poor ones are growing very, very slowly. If Zimbabwe continues at its current growth rate, it will qualify as a rich country in 2,722 years. What we want to know in this film is why some countries prosper and others stagnate, so that we can understand what rich countries are doing right and get a better grip on the challenges and hurdles facing poor countries. There are basically three factors that determine whether a country will be rich or poor. The first is institutions. Institutions are beyond important. Broadly speaking, rich countries have good institutions and poor ones have very, very bad ones. The correlation between poverty and corruption is direct. The richest countries in the world are quite simply invariably also the least corrupt ones. And the most corrupt countries are also the poorest. When countries are corrupt, they can't collect enough taxes to get the good institutions they would need to escape the poverty trap. Half of the wealth of the world's poorest 20 countries goes into offshore accounts. Lost revenues in these countries totals between $10 and $20 billion a year. Meanwhile, without an adequate tax base, poor countries can't invest in police, education, health, and transport. Now, a more generous way to look at corruption is that it's really a case of clan-based thinking. Say you're hiring someone. In the rich countries, you're meant to do so simply on merit, interviewing lots of candidates, then picking the best one, irrespective of any personal connection. But in poor countries, under the sway of clan-based thinking, that approach would itself be seen as corrupt. It's your duty to disregard the so-called best candidate from an anonymous bunch in order to pick someone from your own team, your uncle, your brother, your second cousin, the guys from the same tribe. As a result, poor countries don't allow themselves access to the intelligence and talent of the whole population. There's a second thing that keeps countries poor: culture. What goes on in people's minds, their outlooks and beliefs. A striking statistic pops up here in relation to religion. If there's one generalization you can make about religion and wealth, it's that the less people believe, the richer they stand a chance of being. 19 of the richest countries in the world have 70% or more of their populations saying that religion is not at all important to them. The exception here is, unsurprisingly, the United States, which manages to combine great religiosity with huge wealth. More on that in a second. And conversely, the poorest nations in the world are also extremely believing ones. Here's how many people think religion and the supernatural is deeply important in the following countries. In the world's poorest country, simply everyone is a believer. Why is belief quite so bad for wealth creation? Because in general, religiosity is connected up with the idea that the here and now can't be improved, so you should focus on the spiritual and look forward to a next world instead. It makes quite a bit of sense when you live here. In the rich world, on the other hand, people are generally great believers in their capacity to alter their destiny through effort and talent. Incidentally, to explain the anomaly of the United States, religion seems not to slow down economic growth here because it's a particular sort of religion, an overwhelmingly Protestant and exceptionally materialistic kind. The American God doesn't want you to think of building the New Jerusalem in the next world. He wants it here and now, in Kansas or Houston. There's another big factor that determines the wealth and poverty of nations: geography. Poor countries are overwhelmingly located in the tropical regions. This isn't a coincidence. Life is, in many ways, simply far, far tougher there. The problems begin with agriculture. Tropical plants are generally a lot less packed with carbohydrates. Poor countries have worse soil too. Also, and perhaps surprisingly, a tropical climate can be disadvantageous to photosynthesis. Historically, a key determinant in the likelihood of societies growing rich was their possession of large domesticated animals, such as horses and oxen, which liberated a huge part of the workforce from having to plough by hand. But in tropical Africa, domesticated animals have throughout time been devastated by a further appalling scourge, the tsetse fly. This small fly, exclusively present in Africa because of its heat and humidity, knocks out animals on an enormous scale, making them sleepy or inactive, and has had a profound effect on the ability of Africans to develop technology, increase agricultural productivity, and amass wealth. It isn't just plants and animals that suffer in the tropics. In the middle latitudes, humans are open to a terrifying array of diseases, including 100% of low-income countries are affected by at least 5 tropical diseases simultaneously. The magical temperature, which has helped to make rich countries rich, is 16 degrees centigrade. However superficially unpleasant, that drop below 16 degrees as autumn starts to bite is quite literally a foundation stone of civilization. Geography also encompasses transport, and poor countries are on the whole very badly connected. Landlocked Bolivia and semi-landlocked Paraguay are the poorest nations in South America. Africa has only one major navigable river, the Nile, and hosts 15 landlocked nations, 11 of which have average incomes of $600 a year or less. Not coincidentally, the poorest country in Asia, Afghanistan, is also landlocked. Then there's the matter of natural resources. Natural resources like oil or precious metals can be real trouble, and paradoxically, poor countries tend to have them in spades. These natural resources are what economists call intensifiers. They will help to make a country with good institutions richer, but one with bad institutions get even poorer, precipitating what's called the resources trap. So the Democratic Republic of the Congo is one of the world's most mineral-rich countries, holding most of the world's coltan, which every mobile phone has a bit of inside. But natural resource wealth helps elites to grab money without requiring the cooperation of the whole society. If the only way to grow wealthy is to assemble high-tech aero engines, for example, you're going to need your whole society to buy into the project. But if you just need to extract a few minerals, you can do so with a small labor force, some guns, and an airstrip long enough to ferry your loot out to market. The wealth from coltan keeps DRC armed rebels in guns and corrupts every level of society. So how should one weigh up the relative importance of all these different factors, institutional, cultural, and geographic, in determining the wealth of nations? There's no hard and fast rules, but as a guide, one can suggest that 50% of a nation's wealth comes down to the state of its institutions, 20% is due to its culture, and 10% each can be allocated to latitude, connectivity with the rest of the world, and geological good fortune. If you're a policymaker, this discussion has wide practical implications, but at a more personal level, one might take away two things from it. Firstly, modesty. You should have a better idea of what you owe your individual success to, which is not so much your own hard work or fine mind, as the broader society you live in, which was produced over centuries and which you now draw benefit from unknowingly. At the same time, sympathy, an ability not to see failing societies just as basket cases, but rather as countries facing comprehensible and hugely difficult problems. Our sympathy can be enhanced by reflecting that the troubles of desperate lands are to a considerable extent to do with malaria, a lack of navigable river, and the horrific buzzing of the tsetse fly, rather than always some more intimate human failing, which we would ourselves never manifest.